Morning, and thank you all for joining the working group meeting for the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Phase 2 Initiative. This is Christina Osborne with ISO's Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. So we do have Milos Spasanik from ISO's policy team. He's actually going to provide some opening remarks, and then he's going to turn it over to Jeff Spires, who will present on behalf of Vistra Corp and PowerX on a transmission services and market scheduling priorities long-term framework. Kathleen Colbert is also on the line. She's here representing Vistra. And you'll also see several other stakeholder working group members and ISO representatives who have joined as panelists. I'm not going to go through all the names, but they're listed on the right-hand side of your screen. These working group meetings are intended to be interactive, so please raise your hand if at any time you would like to ask a question or make a comment. And just as a reminder, these discussions may not be representations of official company perspectives and should not be treated as such in order to foster open dialogue and sharing of ideas. We will start by taking questions from the panelists. Sorry, let me go to the next slide. And then we'll open up to the rest of the stakeholder participants. So you can either, in WebEx, you can select the hand icon above the chat window to enter the queue. If you've just dialed into the meeting, you'll want to press #2 on your phone. And please start by introducing yourself. The working group meeting materials and recordings are available on the initiative webpage. We are recording today's session, and we'll post the video file shortly after we receive it from the vendor. And just as a reminder to please ask permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcription. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Milos Spasanik.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today, as Christina said, we're going to hear from PowerX and Vistra on how potentially an approach that they've put forward of how the different pieces fit together for a transmission reservation process to establish wheeling through priorities across the ISO system. We really appreciate Jeff and Kathleen taking the time and putting together the materials for the presentation. I want to note that, where we've covered now a series of meetings across 3 different working group topics. We talked about how ATC and native load needs are calculated. We heard from BPA, SRP, and Idaho on their practices on that front. We also heard on practices of those same entities about how they evaluate requests for transmission service across what time frames they offer transmission products, as well as aspects of their transmission planning processes to expand the system in response to long-term requests if somebody wanted to reserve that long-term firm transmission capability for a year or longer across their system. So we've heard across all of these practices of those 3 entities in the Western interconnection. And I think the next step is, and I think this is a good tee-off today with Jeff and Kathleen presenting their perspectives, but I think the next stage is for us now to take everything we've heard from those entities and the different practices across the West and try to apply them to the ISO and see what type of a transmission reservation framework would be best to put forward to essentially allow wheel-throughs to establish priority for wheeling through the ISO system. And like I said, today we start with Jeff and Kathleen presenting on behalf of Vistra and PowerX on their perspectives. And as a next step at a future working group meeting, we'll be looking to as well, the ISO will be looking to put forward, having heard everything from these working groups and presentations from the California LSCs and Vistra and PowerX, we'll be looking to put forward and stimulate discussion on a potential framework as well, based on everything that we've heard thus far. And we'll schedule that meeting at a future date, and we'll publish a notice on that. But with that context, I really, again, appreciate Jeff and Kathleen taking the time and putting their materials together. The materials are posted on our website. We posted them this morning. So as they go through it, feel free to ask questions, clarifications of them in their presentation. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Milos. Good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX, and as Milos mentioned, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra is also on the line, and we will be presenting together. And just a little bit more background in addition to what Milos already said. PowerX presented and had some ideas early on in this initiative, more focused on some of the shorter term improvements around the existing approach and some additional transparency and concepts that could be applied that we put forward last summer. And at a similar point in time, Vistra had also put forward a written conceptual framework for a potential approach to facilitate a forward reservation process for the CAISO. And I think what we realized is that both PowerX and Vistra had some similar ideas and some areas of common alignment, and we wanted to bring some of those thoughts in a little bit more detail to this group for further discussion. We've heard the previous workshops that have focused on some of the other TSPs in the West and what their approach is for certain elements of how they apply their reservation process and their OAT framework more generally, whether it's native load priority or certain elements of their ATC calculations and some of the other details. And then we also heard a proposal or a concept from the joint California LSCs that laid out some more of a conceptual higher level framework on some of those topics for determining native load priority. And it included some ideas on how a transmission reservation framework would fit into the CAISO market. And I think that type of higher level discussion was very helpful to understand what some of the California LSCs had in mind. And so I think this presentation is similar in some ways to that, where our objective is to put forward some ideas, some concepts for consideration. Certainly not a comprehensive proposal, but we did want to provide a different perspective about several of the key topics that we think are important elements of a forward transmission reservation process, and ultimately with the objective of trying to ensure that we come to a design that supports reliability and promotes competition for the transmission system within the CAISO BA. So if we could go to the next slide, please. At a high level, I think the objectives that we believe are important are establishing a forward transmission reservation process that allows for open access to the CAISO controlled grid, both for the equivalent of network and point-to-point transmission service. And we can get into that in a little bit more detail on what that means. And in a way that's non-discriminatory, non-preferential, and that is consistent with open access principles. And we also would like to discuss the principles and the provisions for that access that are consistent with the policy, including around native load priority, network service, and some of those components that have already been talked about quite a bit in some of the previous meetings. So we do have some discussion on some of those topics here as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today's discussion will be focused in three specific areas. The first is reserving transmission in the forward time frame. And then the second and third are more in the operating time frame. So once the forward process has occurred and transmission contracts have been purchased, how are those scheduled day ahead in real time, and how are curtailments managed day ahead in real time? Because those are also important elements of how an overall proposal would work operationally to ensure it's consistent with the overall objectives and the priorities that are established through that forward reservation process. Next slide, please. So the first topic we would like to start with is the reserving of transmission in the forward time frame. And The background or the context is that CAISO is a transmission service provider required to maintain an OAT tariff that respects open access. We think that participating within an ISO market structure should ultimately be improving upon open access and competition and not have the effect of restricting or limiting it relative to other approaches like bilateral markets or more traditional contract path tagging. And that's really because market benefits are maximized when the rules really ensure open access to this transmission system for all of the entities that are both outside the CAISO and inside the CAISO in a way that's consistent with those open access requirements. And the last point I wanted to make is we think that the rules and the approaches external to the CAISO BA are helpful in terms of informing a framework that can be consistent with open access and achieve these objectives while still being compatible with the CAISO market processes. And I think what you'll find as we move forward through our discussion is these ideas are informed by the more traditional OAT approaches that are used outside of the CAISO BA. And so some of the language and some of the discussion might include some of the terminology and the concepts that have maybe not been as directly relevant to the CAISO markets in the past. But that being said, we think that the groundwork is there, the concepts and principles are the same, and that the opportunities to use some of those ideas and external concepts and apply them to the CAISO equivalent scenarios is a good starting point and a good way to tackle some of these problems. But just of course, to emphasize, we recognize that these ideas need to fit within the CAISO market processes and be compatible ultimately with that. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit wordy, but really the concept here is that there are at least 4 categories of transactions that we think are worth discussing. And in fact, there could be more categories if the CAISO ultimately and stakeholders wanted to explore, for example, non-firm products and other service offerings. But at a minimum, we think that there are at least 4 areas that we should be discussing. And the first one is affording the highest priority to self-schedules serving CAISO load in the CAISO BA, provided that the requirements are met for meeting primary network service. And this is really the topic regarding how to establish native load priority for resources, including imports that meet a certain eligibility criteria. So the first bullet is associated with that. The second bullet is the next category, which is forward firm transmission reservations, often referred to as point-to-point service. These are the transmission reservations that the CAISO would sell through its forward reservation process. And they could really be purchased for any purpose. So, one thing just to point out when we refer to things like point-to-point, that is just trying to refer to the idea that a customer could compete through the forward reservation process for transmission service, whether it was supporting imports to meet CAISO load, exports, wheel-throughs, etc. And that those rights could be used for any of those purposes. The third bullet is what may be a newer category. I'm not certain that this has been discussed at length in these workshops, but the concept of secondary native load priority. And in the context of the pro forma OAT, this is a transmission service priority that is lower than the firm arrangements, but higher than other non-firm uses of the system. And so this concept would be another means for load in the CAISO BA to have priority for importing energy in the short-term markets above and beyond other uses of the transmission system, but not except for the forward firm reservations that were previously arranged ahead of time. And so this is something we think warrants some discussion, and we will come back to that, hopefully to make that a little bit more clear in a future slide. And finally, the last category is other uses of the system that are the lowest priority. And these would essentially be transactions that have not arranged for forward transmission service of some kind. And in those cases, regardless of how those transactions, what purpose they're serving, whether it's imports, exports, or wheel-throughs, they would be afforded the lowest priority below the other categories that I previously walked through. So I kind of said quite a bit there, but I think we are going to tackle each of these in a little bit more detail. I think make it more clear what we're trying to say on this slide. So I think if we move forward to the next slide, there's a visualization that might help. And I believe maybe Kathleen was going to walk through this one, but we can spend a little bit of time here because I think it's helpful just to establish the concept that we have in mind for this discussion.
That sounds good. Hey, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and thanks, Jeff. That was all really great context and setting this up. So I'll tee up the visual that we have here, and we'll kind of both of us walk through it. We wanted to recap essentially what Jeff just went through and show it in a visual format. We are emphasizing this is illustrative. We're just trying to show that like in blue, you can see that there are the potential elements that a forward transmission framework might support. And then in green is really focusing on, well, intertie offers submitted into the daily markets, so day ahead of real time, that did not make any forward reservation requests to secure the transfer capability at a higher priority level prior to those markets. And I'll just kind of go from the top down. We're showing 5 elements here. Jeff mentioned 4 in the prior slide. There is an asterisk, and so when I get there, I'll explain. We've kind of broken the last one out into 2 possible, but there is a further policy discussion that needs to be had for number 4. And so for the purposes of us walking through this, we're kind of making this a little bit more general, and then noting that if there's substance here that warrants more conversations, we need to have some additional, more detailed policy discussions in a later meeting. So with that context, I'll start at the top. So the first element would be primary native load priority. That was the first bullet that Jeff just walked through. And this could be able to be supported through available transfer capability set aside for contracted imports from identified sources that are the equivalent of designated network resources, those requirements that Jeff referred to. And those are requirements to be sufficiently firm to gain this highest priority. The second bullet discussed is for firm uses of the transmission system. We've broken this out into two categories, a 2A and a 2B. 2A is for long-term firm available transfer capability, and just generally speaking, we're thinking of that as annual or longer. And this would be secured through long-term firm service, secured or purchased on a first-come, first-served basis within the firm available transfer capability to support these transactions either to, out of, or through the CAISO BAA. The second subcategory for firm uses is for short-term firm available transfer capability. Generally speaking, that would include requests for monthly, weekly, daily, or hourly firm uses. This short-term firm service could be secured through purchasing on a first come, first served basis within the firm available transfer capability remaining in the order of the duration of that request to support transactions, again, to, out of, or through the CAISO BAA. This third element is the one that we think is potentially newer to this conversation and warrants us talking about it and has a lot of benefits of recognizing it. And that's a secondary native load priority. This would be afforded through remaining short-term available transfer capability, if it's available, being released to support additional imports to the CAISO BAA at a higher priority than other non-firm uses of the system. Number 4 is, we generally are referred to it as short-term non-firm available transfer capability, and I think we put it hourly. Non-firm uses could be secured on a longer duration, monthly, generally monthly, weekly, daily, hourly. But we think that for the sake of this conversation, we want to focus on the overarching framework and would like to defer additional policy discussions on what level of interest there is in the granularity of non-firm uses, if at all, that this forward framework should support to a later conversation. But if it were to be included, conceptually, it would be secured through the remaining short-term available transfer capability, if available, released to support additional intertie transactions to, out of, or through the CAISO BAA that are interested in securing this through non-firm uses rather than firm uses. Now, the final category is really focusing on offers that are submitted into the day-ahead and real-time market that did not engage in any activities to secure that transfer capabilities on a higher priority level. These would be scheduled uses of the transmission system that are without a corresponding forward transmission reservation. This would be afforded in the market optimization, the lowest priority, to these types of transactions that are not supported by a forward reservation. Now I'll take a step back and see, Jeff, do you want to add any context?
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that was a great summary. I agree with you that more discussion around number 4 and whether a shorter term, non-firm type product is necessary or useful would be worth definitely more dialogue, but that at a high level, the explanation you gave around here is the priority for forward reservations, either achieved through the native load priority provisions or through a forward reservation process. Here's how those would play out, and then you have your scheduled use of the system that doesn't have a forward reservation associated with it that would be of a lower priority than those other forward reservations. I think that's the conceptual framework. The only other thing I might add is that number 1, number 2A and 2B, once those rights were established, they would all have equal priority through the market. They're all firm at that point. Native load priority, as you mentioned, is ATC that's set aside for resources that meet the criteria for that. The firm reservations are secured through the reservation process and through first come, first served competition for those rights. But once those have been allocated, they're all firm and they're treated equally.
No, thanks, Jeff. That's a really good, and just to point folks who to the slide where we were trying to represent that detail. If you look to the far right, I would just give the group the context who's less familiar with these priority levels, that when we think about the priority being at the same, let's say, penalty factor level or same value or same decision point, 7 and 6 and 2 are referring to in the world there's more granularity to these because there's more non-firm uses, but the 7 is the same priority level, 6 is a priority, and 2 is a priority as well. just to add that extra context.
This is probably a good time to take some questions, Kathleen. I see there's at least a couple hands in the queue.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, let's go to Doug first, and then if any of the participants have a question, you can either select the hand icon above the chat window or press #2 on your phone if you just dialed in. So let's go ahead and go to Doug first.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Thank you for this presentation. First, a question, are we talking only about intertie transactions, or are we also talking about transactions within the CAISO, from individual resources to either load within CAISO or load outside?
I can take that first. So we are talking about internal generation within the CAISO BAA as well. If a export, to some extent, I think that the focus of our presentation is going to be on the intertie transactions because it's the most relevant means of implementing this type of framework. But it is important to reflect on, like you're bringing up, Doug, that for an export, it is internal generation that may be backing that export. And so when we get into some of the later sections on the scheduling requirement, we can talk a little bit more about how, in detail, the value of having that kind of scheduling requirement, how it helps to accommodate some of the concerns we've talked about in the past on that point. But there's also, and this is kind of a vanilla and apple pie statement, but within the network itself, internal generation that's being dispatched to serve load within the CAISO BAA does have primary native load priority. It's just that it is enforced through the market very seamlessly. It's transactions that are needing to be scheduled that are external that we need to focus on how those interties get that primary native load priority in addition to internal generation. Jeff, do you want to add anything or clarify?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I think at a high level, I generally agree that, at least in our view, the focus has been on external resources and the imports versus wheel-throughs. And we've referred to exports here too, in terms of recognizing that there may be a forward transmission reservation to support any one of those. But I think, as Kathleen pointed out, there's an assumption that resources within the CAISO being used to meet load within the CAISO would sort of be outside of this framework, or at least would be able to be to receive the appropriate priority through the market dispatch.
Okay, so they wouldn't necessarily be in that fifth bucket or fifth tier. I mean, because I'm just
think of it like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to clarify for you. I think of internal generation being dispatched for CAISO needs as in the first category, number one.
Okay, thank you. And because what I'm trying to think about is like the interaction between the market dispatch and the schedules at the interties. And I mean, because CAISO load doesn't, there's a whole deliverability process that's really more attached to the generation resources within the CAISO. And, CAISO is encouraging people to, instead of self-schedule, to bid, right? If the way you reserve your priorities through the scheduling process, and it's the self-schedule has the highest priority, I think we could get into trouble of not having enough bids to clear the market, and then we'd have administrative pricing during the periods when people are concerned about needing the priorities. Maybe you'll get to this when you get to the discussion of scheduling.
I think this is a level of detail that this presentation isn't geared towards addressing. I don't mind addressing it at a super high level, but I want to be sensitive to, not getting too far into commercial kind of conversations. I think that this is really geared in focusing on if an export is needed to be sent outside of the CAISO BAA because it has been contracted, that has, and there needs to be an ability for that export transaction to be backed against a higher priority if it goes out and secures through this framework a higher level priority transmission reservation, which under long-term contracts, that is likely to be a requirement. And I think when you while CAISO may want more economic offers, when something has already been contracted, I don't think it is as much of a concern. I think it's more likely that a self-schedule would need to be used because it has already been contracted to be exported, if that makes sense.
That's helpful. I appreciate that. I guess I'm just thinking through maybe we could come back to this after you go through the presentation more.
Yeah, that'd be great. And when we get to the scheduling section, I've made a note on your question so that we can talk a little bit more in detail on the interaction between internal gen and the intertie transactions when we get to the scheduling section. So we'll revisit it for you, Doug.
Great, thank you.
And others. I'm sure there's lots of who are curious, so it's a great question. Thanks.
Okay, I did see Milos is in the queue, and then Anthony. Actually, Anthony, we'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Milos. And just a reminder to unmute yourself, Anthony.
Thanks for the reminder, Christina. Just one question. Where would capacity procured in the RUC process fall here?
Jeff, do you want to try and take that one first? Do you want me to?
I'm just giving some thought to that. This discussion so far has been on the mechanisms to arrange for transmission service on a forward basis. So before we've, absent the green area, I suppose, where we've been talking about once you're in, you've got the market solution scheduling transmission that doesn't have a forward reservation associated with it. But the blue area was intended to reflect transmission that the CAISO is either carving out of the ATC for native load on a forward basis or making available for purchase on a forward basis. And so the assumption I think that we're making here is that all of those reservations have been made prior to the day-ahead market and entering the day-ahead market, in which case the scheduled use of the system through the markets would be consistent with those forward reservations, whether it's IFM or RUC. So I'm not sure if I'm directly answering your question, but I suppose it would depend upon whether that RUC resource that you're referring to had one of these forward contracts associated with it or not. Does that help to answer that question?
I think it does, which I guess gets to a more basic question. Is this basically imposing an OAK transmission reservation framework on every transaction in the ISO? Basically, wheels, exports, internal load. Is it going that far? It's not clear to me.
I don't believe so. I don't think that was the intention. I think we're trying to establish, sort of along the lines of the discussion we were just having with Doug, a framework for transactions, for transmission reservations, particularly with respect to competing uses for the interties. And so at least, and that's in my mind sort of what we're trying to achieve with this type of concept. So I don't think it goes to the level of, trying to put the entire sort of more traditional boat framework into the CAISO BA in general. But, Kathleen, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I understand the question. I don't think we're trying to go that far.
I completely agree with that, Jeff. And, and not to maybe overuse words, but opt-in versus opt-out. Anthony, when I hear the words impose, I hear that it's a framework that someone needs to be able to figure out how to opt out. And that's not what this is suggesting. This is really an opt-in, a forward transmission reservation process that entities could opt into and receive appropriate priority for its transactions in exchange for paying access charges above and beyond. So it is an additional priority level commensurate with a cost. And I think that is probably maybe that's a high level principle to anchor in, but I would just reemphasize that this is context wise would be a new service that entities that need it would pursue, not that it's imposing something on this. If nobody pursued this, I think it would be status quo, which is why I don't see it as imposing. Any other questions?
All right, yeah, looks like we have Jeff Nelson in the queue. So let's go to Jeff next, and then also Milos after Jeff. So
hey,
go ahead, Jeff.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me. It's Jeff Nelson, SE. I'm just trying to make sure I'm starting at the ground level, the foundational understanding. I may be just sort of missing obvious things, so I apologize, but trying to really understand. What right, if someone gets this, let me choose one of your buckets, 2A. Why don't we use 2A? What actual rights does this convey to the owner? What does it get the person? What do they have for his obligations to schedule with it? Timing of scheduling? What happens if they don't use it? What resale rights? What do they get for this?
So Jeff, that's a great question. We have 15 more slides. So this is really high level questions right now. And the reason I'm just asking if it's all right if we defer is we have a lot of content still to go through, and I think it'll address those types of questions. And if it doesn't, please ask them when we kind of wrap up the presentation, or if you have any. We recognize, as Jeff said, this is not a comprehensive proposal, but we do have more content on the specifics, if you don't mind deferring.
I don't at all. I just want to put one more placeholder. Hopefully we can get through this. And it has to do with how do the reserves work with all this proposal? If the ISO sells this firm transmission, are they also selling reserves to back up any transactions that happen with it? And you don't have to answer now, but so I can sort of understand how all this works together. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Okay, let's go to Milos, and then we can keep going with your presentation. We'll go to Milos next. Anthony, I don't know if you have signed up. Not sure if that's from before. But go ahead, Milos.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Kathleen. So just a couple of questions, and I think some of the other folks asked similar questions that I was going to, but just it sounds like under this framework, if we take it a step higher, it sounds like this is putting forward a transmission reservation framework, and I think you clarified that it's primarily, at least at this stage, the focus is on those intertie transactions, but it allows for transmission reservations, but also it allows parties to access the system even without a forward transmission reservation, and that's, I think, your bucket 5 or your column 5 here. My question is, and maybe Jeff, I think you maybe got to this. I think you teed this up, but is there value in that number 4 bucket, short-term non-firm ATC, if you have that bucket 5. I think it's something to keep in mind as we go throughout the discussions. But the more pointed question is, if we're looking at bucket number 1, are you suggesting, or is this framework putting forward that there would need to be an explicit reservation by, let's say it's a load serving entity that's looking to import RA capacity? Is that load serving entity explicitly submitting a reservation for transmission service, or are you envisioning that under this bucket 1, within the ATC calculation, there's a certain amount of transmission that is set aside for native load at those points without necessarily needing a forward reservation for that?
Milos, it's Jeff. I'll take a crack at that, and Kathleen can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, much like a lot of the discussion in the prior workshops, the primary native load priority would be ATC that's set aside ahead of time and carved off from the firm ATC that's then made available for bucket 2A and 2B. I think where, as you'll see in the future slides, I think where the differing perspectives would be from some of the ideas that have been put forward from others is, what are the eligibility criteria to allow for that native load priority to be exercised through that set aside? So I think that's where there will be a difference, but like mechanically speaking, I think the way you said that is generally consistent with my understanding. And but I think the other point you made first, just to emphasize, I really do think that this concept that we're discussing is focused on intertie transactions, and I think evaluating it in that context and will be useful. Just to go back to some of the previous questions around, are we trying to assign a lower priority to internal generation, to internal load, or something like that? And that was not the context of putting this together. It was really focused on, for example, what do you do when you have an import and a wheel-through transaction on the same intertie? How do you facilitate forward competition to secure firm rights? And to Jeff Nelson's question, I didn't fully understand the second half of this question, but at the most basic level, if you were to purchase firm rights under, say, 2A, you would receive the higher physical priority. If you're a wheel through, for example, then you would have the same priority as an import that has primary native load priority to flow if you're both self-scheduling in the same hour at the same intertie. And of course, there are obvious other areas. For example, are there economic considerations, CRRs, et cetera, that we're not getting into here. But from a starting point, these priorities are intended to represent the ability for someone to compete for firm transmission on a forward basis. They would pay the appropriate access charge in exchange for that higher physical priority.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, very helpful. And I do appreciate that narrowing. I think it provides a lot of clarification and hopefully a bit less heartburn if at least the starting point here, the focus is on the energy. So appreciate that clarification. Okay, no more questions for me, Christina.
Awesome, great. Great, thank you so much everyone for the questions, really great. I'm gonna ask to move on to the next slide and let's delve into some more details now that we've kind of laid the landscape. So let's talk about that bucket number 1 first, primary native load priority. So some context, under the pro forma OAT, a network customer or a transmission provider can use what in the external to CAISO world, folks refer to as network integration transmission service to serve its network load or native load customers if it meets network load requirements. To the extent network load is not served by a designated network resource, the resource or contract that serves that network load has a lower priority. This multi-tier priority level ensures that network and native load customers are only afforded the highest priority rights or the other secondary priority rights we discussed when they make sufficiently firm arrangements. Next slide. The goal of these rules is that, so I'm trying to take a step back. What's the goal of these rules? That they should balance between, there needs to be a balance between the network customer or transmission provider's need to meet its native load obligations and the need of other entities to obtain service from that transmission provider to meet their own obligations. A couple quotes that we think are illustrative that we wanted to bring the group back to is, one is from Order 890, ordering paragraph 1494. So under this paragraph in FERC's order, FERC stated that order number 888 has long required the contracts be executed and imposed reasonable restrictions on the types of resources that may be designated as network resources. Maybe an additional piece of information to kind of map this is Order 888 came out first. There were additional requests for rehearings, clarifications, and Order 890 was FERC's order to respond to some of the questions on implementation and compliance that entities had raised in between the initial open access rules and kind of this later clarification. And so when you read this, is what FERC is saying is that it imposed reasonable restrictions on the types of resources that may be designated as network resources, affirming that earlier direction. Additionally, in the same kind of, or in the same order paragraph 1493, FERC also reminded that Congress did not require that the load serving entities be able to take transmission without limitations of any kind in order to serve their native load. Nothing in Section 217 statute suggests that LSE should not be required to comply with reasonable requirements that are necessary to prevent undue discrimination and to maintain a reliable transmission system. And I think it's illustrated just to kind of focus on, well, this is a lot of words, focus on the goal. The goal is to prevent undue discrimination and to maintain system reliability. With that, next slide. So what do we mean by that? How do we do that? So to afford primary native load priority, the network customer, and I note transmission provider, also must demonstrate that it owns or has committed to purchase generation pursuant to an executed contract in order to designate a generating resource as a network resource, also from Order 890. This next one is just kind of adding clarification from the pro forma OAT sheet 96, which provides additional clarity that the transmission provider, which can secure designated network resources on behalf of its native load customers, is also required to designate resources and loads in the same manner as any network customer. The purpose of us providing these quotes here is just to say that if we're talking about the CAISO, or if we're talking about a load serving entity within the CAISO, we can generalize the rest of these requirements to the types of resources that are eligible for designated network resource highest priority treatment, aligned with firm uses, can be generalized to those intertied transactions. Order number 890 also provided some guidance on what types of verification or validation is needed to support that off-system purchases, supporting that have been contracted and or firmed up, said differently, firmed up in order to serve internal or CAISO load, include a few things. So the resource needs to be able to, if it's an off-system resource, one, it needs to be able to identify the amount of power that the customer has rights to. So the internal network customer has rights from that resource that's off system. It needs to identify the control area from which the power will be sourced. It needs to identify the delivery point that the network customer will take possession of that power. And then it needs to identify transmission arrangements on the external systems to that CAISO order. Next slide. With that, Jeff, I'll tee it over to you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kathleen, the last couple of slides that Kathleen just walked through references FERC precedent and some of the quotes that that are talking about native load priority. This slide is conclusions that I think I can speak to from PowerX's perspective, and Kathleen may want to weigh in from Vistra's point of view, but really this slide is about taking a step back and trying to establish the criteria to just really evaluate whether whatever framework the CAISO ultimately uses and the rules that get implemented, do they genuinely achieve open access and foster competition? And I think that's really the high level objective here in terms of striking that right balance between native load priority and providing open access for other potential users of the transmission system. In our view, that one methodology that's consistent with what Kathleen was just describing is to exercise that primary native load priority. That should be limited to resources that meet that definition of being sufficiently firm, which is at a minimum that they can be identified and that the characteristics, including the transmission and how it will get delivered to the CAISO, should be something that can be identified. And that is helping to ensure that other entities, including the wheel-through customers, are able to compete for the ATC on those highly desired paths during those highly desired periods. And so in our view, what we really want to avoid is an approach that extends that native load priority to an extent where the holdback of transmission on those key paths or in those key periods is such that the third-party entities that are seeking service really don't have an ability to compete. And so, of course, as we talked about and we'll get into again, if those entities want service, they need to be willing to enter the queue, compete with others, pay for that transmission service, et cetera. So, we fully recognize that, but ultimately we want to ensure that the opportunity to do that is there in practice. And I think that that's an important outcome that we would like to make sure occurs no matter, what the final approach ends up looking like. So Kathleen, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add to that. Otherwise, I would turn it back to you to keep moving.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's really good level setting. I mean, there's more that we could discuss on this, but I'd like to move us through until slide 14, which will take us through the secondary native load. I'll do 12, but then open it up after that because I think that'll give us a good point to kind of have gone through all the native load priority pieces. So I will start with the next bucket. So now the next bucket, which as Jeff mentioned in clarification earlier on when we looked at the visual, would have the same loading or scheduling as well as curtailment priority as bucket one because they're for firm uses. But we separated these again into two. So let's talk a little bit about long-term firm transmission reservations. We think it's important that under this a durable framework that the forward reservation process includes the ability for entities to seek long-term firm transmission of reservations. Firm transmission service can be used to support imports, exports, or wheel-throughs across the CAISO transmission system. These reservation requests should be made available on a first-come, first-served basis, said differently, in the chronological sequence in which each transmission customer has requested service within the firm available transfer capability that has been calculated at that point in time. Entities can submit firm requests into an annual process for a term of a year or more, and if awarded, pay access charges for this term of service. For a request longer than 13 months is probably coming from me. 13 months, generally speaking, is when you look at the NERC standards, the delineation point. For CAISO's purposes, it could be 12 months, so I should have made this more general. But so for requests longer than a year, the CAISO may need to calculate available transfer capability outside of what it does on a recurring basis, and study whether any upgrades are needed to accommodate the longer term request that spans beyond a year, in addition to kind of the recurring calculation for annual requests or less. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. For forward, speaking of annual or less, we also believe this forward reservation process needs to support the ability of entities to seek firm transmission service on a short-term basis. These also would be able to support imports, exports, or wheel-throughs across the CAISO transmission system. Similarly, these requests would be made available on a first-come, first-served basis. Said differently, made available in the chronological sequence in which each transmission customer has requested service within the firm available transfer capability estimated at that time. Entities can submit firm requests with either a monthly, a weekly, a daily, or an hourly duration in advance of the day-ahead market processes. So this is all still in the forward timeframe. If awarded the reservation, that entities would pay access charges for commensurate with the term of service that it had requested. And this is just kind of a practical note. There will need to be a lot of details defined on how these requests would be, the timelines around the requests, when the calculations would need to be performed, made available for an automated approvals of such requests. With that in mind, there of course will need to be deadlines. So that's a reasonable accommodation to support implementation of this type of proposal. And just threw out a couple examples of if, depending on what time frame the CAISO determines it needs, between when a request is submitted and when it is able to be used to secure transmission, this could require those requests to be in 14 days prior for a monthly request, 7 days prior to the week for a weekly request, and prior day for a daily or hourly request. And all of those are implementation details, or that we can work through if this is something that we want to continue exploring. Next slide. With this one, Jeff, do you want to go through this one first?
Sure. So we've walked through the first couple of categories. The first is native load priority, which would be the carve out of ATC, as we already talked about, limited to resources. When we're talking about external resources, limited to resources that have been contracted and that are identifiable. The second bucket is firm transmission that the CAISO makes available for purchase, either long-term or short-term, and that could be for any user of the system, whether it's a wheel-through or a load looking to import additional energy that was not part of the native load priority. But the third, this other concept is secondary native load priority, and this seemed as something worth considering, in which, in addition to developing a forward firm transmission product, the CAISO should consider enabling a secondary native load priority for CAISO load. And what this would look like is it would give the CAISO an opportunity to release remaining ATC that was not already sold as long-term or short-term firm, to support imports to the CAISO at a higher priority than other shorter-term uses of the system. And that sub-bullet is some of the language that, in the context of the pro forma out, that it's sort of pulling from that, where it's a concept of load being met by non-designated network resources. And so what this would do is it would enable a higher priority for CAISO load to be met with spot market imports relative to other users of the system that have not secured firm transmission on a forward basis. So if there was an opportunity for an import to meet load in the CAISO BA on a short-term basis, that would be a higher priority than a transaction on that intertie that did not have any forward reservation associated with it and was just an intertie bid that was made in the day ahead or real time market. So it would give another opportunity for higher priority, even for resources that don't meet the primary native load priority that we talked about under category 1. But the other thing I would also point out, as we mentioned before, we think that that primary native load priority is something that needs to be appropriately limited, or limited in a way that the resources that are being assigned that primary priority are those that have been contracted for. Kathleen walked through some of the other criteria around identifying the source of the supply and the transmission. And so it could be that there are certain RA import contracts that if they don't meet that criteria and couldn't identify the source or the external transmission they're using to deliver it to the CAISO BA, they would not qualify for that primary native load priority. And so instead, they would fall under potentially this secondary native load priority because those same requirements would not be applicable. So I'll stop there because I see that Milos has a question, but I think this was also the end of this section on native load priority, so it's probably a good place to take some further questions.
And just a reminder, if you have a question, you can either select the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you're going to want to press #2 on your phone. So Milos, we'll go to you first and see if anybody enters the queue.
Sounds good. Thank you. If we can maybe go back to just starting with the point 1, native load priority. I've got a question there and then one question on each one of the subsequent elements. But on the native load priority aspect, it sounds like, as you said, Jeff, it's a carve out of ATC, but it would be only a carve out, it sounds like, if those requirements, those contractual requirements are met. Is there a suggestion that, especially if ATC is calculated a bit further out, I think what we heard from some of the other transmission providers is that you can set aside transmission capacity for native load needs or network load needs without yet having a contract in place. It depends really on the assumptions that you have in place for deriving that native load priority, depending on the load forecast you're using and the generation dispatch that you're using. But there may be instances where, depending on the load forecast, you may not yet, have generation under contract, and they yet still reserve it. At some point closer in time, those parties may need to designate those resources. But for reserving ATC for native load or existing transmission commitments for native load, I think we heard that there is an ability to set aside some of that transmission in advance of any of those contracts being executed, based again on the different assumptions, the load forecast, and recognizing that some of these contracts may not be executed until closer in time, and you don't necessarily want to leave an imbalance between load and resources that are serving that load. But wanted to just get your reaction to that and just make sure that I understand that the proposal here is that you would only carve out ATC at the interties, regardless of the time frame that you calculate ATC, only if the contract is in place and it meets some of those requirements that were laid out, and that there would be no room to reserve that ATC or that transmission or set it aside for native load absent a contract, and then maybe later down the line, some of the requirements kick in. But wanted to just get your thoughts on that and just better understand if that's the suggestion here.
Thanks, Milos, and I would ask Kathleen to weigh in on this too. And I know this is a really important part of the discussion. And I also understand that different entities have different practices, and particularly as you're talking about, the planning horizon and looking at adding external resources to meet load and how do you account for that. I think there are different approaches to try to achieve that. When I look at some of what Kathleen walked through before, in our mind, there is a direct link between native load priority and the equivalent of designating the network resources with the requirements that that resource be under contract to or owned by the load, and that's an important part of assigning native load priority when it's appropriate to do so, but not extending into an area that I think is concerning, which is if in effect the outcome results in carving out the ATC in order to facilitate future market purchases. And I think that's where it gets to be a situation that we don't think is consistent with the FERC precedent or the objectives of really enabling open access. And so, based on that precedent and what we see, we think that the most appropriate approach would be to say that these forward contracting requirements need to be met to enable that native load priority. Otherwise, the load in the CAISO BA could either participate in the firm reservation process like any other user, or use the secondary native load priority that we were just discussing to the extent that there's further transmission available on that given intertie. But I'll turn it over to Kathleen to see if she has any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks for, I think it's a great question, Milos. I want to provide some additional context for the process of kind of putting this together. Jeff and I talked a lot about like what would be most beneficial for this initial conversation, and wanted to keep it really high level. In the course of it, we identified a few things that need to be deferred to later conversations, because it does require more granular level policy discussions, and this is one of them. So the two we identified were really, is there a need for non-firm uses, yes or no? And the second is, well, what's the devil in the details on the ATC calculation? That itself, we could have done, because I tried to mock it up, I can tell you like 30 slides, and we just didn't have time for it in this conversation. So the way that I have been thinking about it is, if we have some consensus that this is a conversation worth continuing to have, I'd like to have another meeting where we go through and focus on the ATC piece and what is appropriate there. But my initial reaction to the question is, from Vistra's perspective, we acknowledge that some inclusion of load growth is appropriate for a native load priority for set aside in ATC, as long as it's reasonable and it does not disrupt the appropriate balance between native load requirements and open access for other parties. That is really the punchline of this. And it avoids undue discrimination. I think that when we get into maybe this next working group meeting on the ATC in more detail, if we decide we want to pursue and talking about this, then we'll carve out time to have that conversation, pun intended. The reason I think it needs a lot more time is it really depends on which elements we want to work on. If you say there's no, if the CAISO says we don't want to do anything more than a year, then that's a very different conversation on what types of flexibility there is than if you said, well, we need to have rules that contemplate 5-year out requests or 2-year out or even a year and a half. And so I think we need to get some more comfort with continuing to have this conversation before we start getting into exactly how load growth might be accommodated in the different ATC calculations at different points in time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, I guess, for the broader audience that we've been hearing throughout our discussions and presentations that, as Jeff said, there's different methods of doing these things and different approaches that parties take for setting aside transmission for native load needs. Some that may not require a contract depending on the time frame. So just wanted to acknowledge that that's out there as well, and appreciate that response, Jeff and Kathleen. Just one question on point 2A. I think it's a slide maybe 13 or so. If you can go, there we go. Or maybe it's the next one, 13. So I think you were suggesting, Kathleen, transmission service down to the hourly level, and I recognize again we'll need to get into some details later down the line on this, but I'm just not sure how. I think we'll need to consider where the buck stops, at least on the ISO system. Is it down to the hourly transmission reservation process? I'm not sure how compatible that is with certain aspects of the market, but also wanted to acknowledge that the hourly firm product is not necessarily a pro forma per firm product, meaning that I think parties can choose to adopt that product, at least on the old framework, if they see a need for it. But I think the pro forma goes all the way down just to daily. And I just see some challenges with the hourly concept at the ISO system. So that's just a comment. And then on slide 14, just wanted to one more comment or question on that. And I think, Jeff, you raised the connection well there, and as you're familiar, we've had some of these discussions as well at the CPUC level. But that last bullet there, that there are some implications here along at least secondary network load, secondary native load priority on this slide, that there are some potential implications here on, I think, throughout here on the RA products and the timelines of resource adequacy showings, certain amount of contracts that have to be shown in the annual time frame versus the monthly time frame. But this one also implies that certain types of RA imports that may not have a source specified or may not necessarily be delivered on a particular type of transmission may not qualify for native load priority, but rather under that point number one, but rather would fit under this secondary low priority in your scenario. So that's just a comment, no question, but something for us to keep in mind, I guess, throughout this. How does resource adequacy fit into it, and does the framework that's being put forward with certain contractual requirements that have to be in place, certain contractual requirements that have to be met, how does that comport with the RA program? And is this approach driving or requiring changes to the RA framework in order to make it fit with the transmission reservation process that's being put forward? But I'll stop there and go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, this is Kathleen. I really appreciate those comments, and it's something that I'd like to respond to, because I think the elegance of this proposal, it is not requiring changes to the RA program. It may incentivize transactions that are offered to LSEs under the RA program to be higher quality, which overall is a big advantage and benefit that the CAISO could see from this, because it's incentives rather than a requirement. The other thing so I just keep that in mind, I really do see this as providing additional incentive structures on kind of more of the commercial activity side to consider whether or not entities could provide a greater, competitive advantage in offering their services to load service entities versus others who aren't willing to take those kinds of actions. And so this is, it's one of the things that I find elegant from a system reliability perspective. The other just caution I would give is that this proposal does not contemplate, really interacting with RA or the RA processes. It's separate and distinct the way that at least I'm envisioning implementation. So there may be overlap, but really the transmission rules themselves would be set up independent of those kinds of considerations. And then in the registration process, have to meet those requirements to get the higher priority, but it's specific, at least in my approach, and I'll defer to Jeff, this proposal is intended to be separate and distinct from RA, although I do think it sends some really nice incentives to that program to be more firm and better support reliability. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I agree with you that this is not, that this proposal is separate from the RA requirements, but I agree with what Milos has said, and that's why we raised it here, is that it could have an impact on how RA resources are treated, in particular if import RA rules allow contracts that aren't supported by an identifiable resource or transmission, then they could be treated differently because they wouldn't qualify for that primary network or primary native load priority. And so, as Kathleen pointed out, that could provide an incentive for import RA contracts to include that information, but it's not a requirement per se, but certainly import RA contracts may be treated differently depending on whether or not they could meet that necessary criteria to get the primary native load priority.
Thank you. Christine, I think we can move on to some other questions.
Sure. Yeah, we'll go to Jeff Nelson next.
Again, I really want to make sure I'm understanding this because I hope I don't understand it. So what I'm hearing you saying is forget about load growth, but in order for California to have priority access to its own transmission, it has to arrange transmission contracts outside of California to specific resources or resource groups. So the only way California gets priority access to its own transmission is by signing contracts for transmission with other balancing authorities. Do I understand your proposal?
I think that is, if you go back to slide, I've forgotten which slide it is now, I don't have it in front of me, but the slide that identifies the criteria for essentially designating an external network resource, those would be the same criteria or similar that would be used here for CAISO to receive native load priority. So I think the simple answer to your question is likely yes, unless Kathleen disagrees with that.
That's really helpful because I'll just have to say that I strenuously object to this proposal. I think it's an absolute non-starter, and frankly, I don't think we should spend any more time discussing it. Thank you.
You didn't even let me chime in, Jeff. Slide 7. Okay. No, I appreciate it. I heard that. I think that a few answers that I'd give is that I think this illustration, glad it added it, is really helpful. Primary native load priority is the first bucket. It would be included as an ATC set aside. I absolutely see that as providing the highest priority access to load serving entities to secure transmission system through the set aside for sufficiently firm resources. I think what counts as sufficiently firm, we've put forward the FERC orders on open access as a starting point. I think that this is an implementation detail. And I just strongly not implementation detail. It is a conversation that warrants additional policy discussions on what requirements how that would be refined and documented in detail. I just encourage us not to throw the baby out with the bathwater until we have that additional level of conversation. If you have sufficiently firm resources, then it's a set aside for primary native load. From a system reliability perspective, though, Jeff Nelson, I think that you are incentivized to want to have sufficiently firm resources so that the resources you've contracted with are able to support reliability. So I really don't want you to walk away from this proposal thinking that what your hope is inconsistent. It's just that we need to get alignment on what sufficiently firm is. I don't disagree with what Jeff Spires said. I just wanted to know that it would have transmission, it would have some kind of transmission requirement, and we need to kind of continue going through those details.
A transmission access conversation is not a resource adequacy design mechanism.
Correct. This is separate and distinct from that.
You're proposing the ISO adopt the rules of the Northwest Power Pool's resource adequacy program. That's a separate conversation than transmission planning.
I'm definitely not.
You need to conflate those two issues together. I mean, we're talking about access to transmission that California's already paid for, that we don't have access unless we pay someone else for permission to use our own transmission. It's just nonsensical.
Respectfully, Jeff, we're not conflating anything with RA at all. As I clarified with Milos, this proposal is separate and distinct from the Resource Adequacy Program in California. What I was explaining to you is that you have incentives that I just encourage you to recognize that you have incentives to secure resources that are sufficiently firm. So I don't see this proposal as inconsistent or as something that isn't worth pursuing. I also think this proposal is deeply rooted in open access and equitable access to the CAISO's transmission system. And I would not lose sight, encourage you not to lose sight of the elements that we're referring to here as other firm uses would also be paying for transmission access. And those transmission access charges is a later policy conversation as well as to where we allocate those funds. A lot of what you're raising, it merits additional conversation. We do think that this has a lot of merit, supports overall reliability, and avoids undue discrimination. Jeff Spires, you want to add anything before we move to the next question?
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that was a good explanation, and I think, you know, just back to what we'd been talking about earlier, I think we're trying to find that right balance so that California load has the appropriate native load priority to bring in contracts from other systems, and that we recognize that, but do so in a way that is also consistent with providing the ability for other customers to compete for transmission service across the CAISO network. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to get to.
Okay, I do see, it looks like Alan Meck has his hand raised. So let's go to Alan first, and then also Chris Devon is in the queue as well. So Alan, go ahead.
Hi, this is Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric, and I just wanted to second Jeff's vote that we not spend any more time on this proposal.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate hearing your perspective. I will just echo again that in order for a durable framework to be defensible, it needs to support open access. Rules have been recognized. This proposal is attempting to thread that needle and encourage the CAISO to consider it in light of these comments, that if additional conversations can be held, we can work through some of these more granular level policy discussions. Thanks.
Okay, operator, let's go to Chris Devon, and then we'll go to Anthony Zonkovich.
Okay, sure. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. After that, please proceed with your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Hi there, this is Chris Devon with Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, hi, Chris.
Hey, Kathleen. Yeah, so I first I'll have a question and then a point. I think question on kind of at the risk of getting into the discussion, because I understand the debate here a little bit that's been ongoing, and I think, you know, I don't want to risk kind of take you guys off the rails here, but I do kind of want to just pry into maybe some of the existing RA concepts a little bit, like the concept of the maximum import capability. And I think this whole process does actually overlap with the RA program, and it needs to overlap with the RA program. So I just want to provide another perspective here and just say that in my mind, it seems like the MIC is a set aside that's very similar in my mind to primary native load priority service here, number one, and that you could use that somewhat as a proxy for something like a set aside for firm ATC in that sense. And I think that might be one way to maybe secure or bridge the gap between, I think, maybe like what SCE is saying and perhaps, you know, this viewpoint, and that there needs to be some consideration of the internal provisions and programs for import RA, and that, you know, without majorly overhauling that whole process, maybe that could fit in here in this proposal. And maybe if you identified how that might fit in, it could be helpful. And so that's just an idea, maybe a question if you guys think that might be something worth pursuing or discussing further.
Jeff, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that feedback. And I think I agree that the MIC allocation would need to be evaluated in light of pretty much any forward reservation framework that's ultimately put in place, whether it's something like this or something different. So I think just the need to evaluate the MIC process is a really good point, as would be probably other related areas like CRRs and any impacts that might stem from that, and the interaction of having a forward reservation process with both your CRRs and MIC allocations. I don't think that I'm in agreement, at least just thinking off the top of my head, that the MIC allocation would serve the purpose of determining the native load priority, because I think that starts to be challenging insofar as sort of putting the carve out first before the contracting occurs rather than the other way around. But that being said, I think your point in general is taken, and something that would definitely need more consideration.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I just throw it out there because it seems like that might be a starting point to maybe have some, type of agreement or horse trading on this a little bit, because it does seem like that's been primarily the previous concept that we've used for essentially setting aside that capability for the use of native load by the LSCs in the past. And so maybe it's not. I hear you on the ordering of the contracting and kind of the designated network resources. So I guess that leads pretty well into my other point, which is just I think there needs to be some give and take on both sides of this discussion, in my view, because it feels like there's the existing provisions and process and lack of reservation system and use of MIC in the RA imports space, and all of these concepts have been put in place back when we started the market, and there was an idea that there was enough slack on the system for transmission and for resources that it wasn't necessary to maybe do some of these other concepts that were in place in the other areas. But I do think that I will just say I see that this more of a forward transmission reservation framework that looks a little bit more like the OAT world that you guys are presenting here does have some merits that seem to line up with how other regions do things, in my understanding of how like MISO and PJM and other areas do, and some of the stuff that Milos had actually presented back in the earlier stages of this. And I do just note that, we did bring this whole concept up initially through the MIC initiative, and then, obviously realized it had a lot more touch points and other things like the CRRs you mentioned and other things, Jeff. So I think I just would say I would vote for, more discussion on this should be considered, because I think we're going to have to get somewhere that's in between both these sides. I'll stop with that. Thanks.
No, thanks, Chris. This is Kathleen. Some extra context I'd add to kind of crowdsource with the rest of the stakeholder community too, is that we were kind of referencing when things were initially set up. I personally try to remind people when I have kind of offline conversations that when these were set up, the use of the transmission system was really different. So it's important to note that the existing paradigm was set up at a time when there was an expectation that there was sufficient transfer capability across the CAISO system, in, out, through, to support competition for that transfer capability, both for native load purposes as well as for external entities seeking to, let's say, for example, wheel through the CAISO system. It was expected that there was sufficient headroom to accommodate that through the market's operations. And I think consistent, and it's my personal view that what MIC is doing is not setting aside use of the transmission system for native load. Really, the transmission system is optimized under today's implementation. It was expected there was sufficient transfer capability, so there was no set aside necessarily performed for this purpose. I totally agree with you, though, and I want to just clarify the way that I interpret it is there was not a set aside of transmission. It was assumed to be sufficient. The MIC process is providing, in my mind, and I know there are more experts on the panelists, so feel free, but trying not to get too far into MIC, but I see it as really ensuring that the amount of RA that was transacted to be provided from external off-system sources does not exceed what the system can support from a deliverability perspective during times of need. And so I really see it as more of a deliverability check and a cap on not overly transacting with external resources if a simultaneous transfer cannot be supported by the system, rather than a set aside. So small clarification there. But I think it's, I mean, from my perspective, but I think it's a wicked good point because how we set this framework up back in the day was hinged on there being sufficient transfer capability. And as a group, I think it's prudent and just fair that we all recognize that that assumption is no longer true. Under today's operations, the CAISO doesn't have sufficient transfer capability to go to for all entities, both external and internal, to compete for that transfer capability on an open access basis, which is why we were confronted with curtailments of different intertie transactions. And we have these additional risks confronting internal entities, external entities, et cetera. And so a lot of our perspective is that we need to recognize this reality. Since the CAISO controlled grid is now being oversubscribed and there is not sufficient capability, we think it's now necessary to explore how to provide these longer term opportunities to reserve this capacity on an open access basis that avoids undue discrimination, so that there is an option for entities that opt into this type of framework to schedule on those higher priority levels in the daily markets. It really does hinge on, we're not where we used to be. Our operations are different today. Jeff, you want to add anything before we move on?
No, thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, it looks like Anthony has his hand raised, and then Milos just re-entered the queue. And Alan, I'm not sure if you had your hand raised from before, if you had another comment that you'd like to make. But we'll go to Anthony first.
One question and one comment. I assume that bucket number 1 includes things like CBM and TRM.
That is correct, Anthony.
Okay. And just, a general comment, and I think this has come up in the last several comments. I think we do have to recognize that we're not starting from scratch. This is not sort of, an ISO that hasn't been formed yet. And we need, I think, to find a way to all get together and make this work, given the framework that we have, and find a way to accommodate, for some forward transmission reservations without undoing the entire system and everything that's been done for the last 20-something years. And I think that's the challenge, and I think it's going to require all of us, to put our heads together and see how you can sort of meld the two concepts together without, completely undoing everything. So I think that's a challenge that we're going to have to, really work on as we look ahead to getting this achieved.
Heard, understood, and acknowledged, Anthony. Thank you. Before we move to Milos, just a quick time check. We've got like 22 minutes left, and we do have 2 more sections. So with that disclaimer, Milos.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, we'll move on. Just a couple of quick notes. I think what we're hearing throughout this discussion is the reservation process should work with existing processes that we have in place, including the RA framework, such that resources that are procured under that RA framework have the ability to establish that priority, rather than excluding certain potential resources from that based on the requirements that are input. And I think that's something we have to talk through and walk through. But the other thing I wanted to know, just when we're talking about some of the requirements under the oath for designating resources, I think there's also the concept that you don't necessarily have to meet the firm upstream transmission requirement and specify the source if you're taking title at a particular, depending on where you're taking title to the resource. So if you're taking title at the point of interconnection between DAs. I don't think that requirement is in place for firm transmission or the source specification requirement, which I think is a bit more flexible when considering different types of arrangements that may be in place. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well, and that's I think that the slide that talks about point one and some of those requirements may be a bit more rigid than requiring or acknowledging the concept that FERC has also noted that depending on where you take title to that generation is where you have to demonstrate some of these requirements. So that may be also a little bit of room to work with if this is not the path that we want to evaluate down the road.
Milos, thanks. I just want to, and I don't mean, I actually do think those requirements does not preclude that. So that's straight from the order. Order also include, I mean, what you're saying is accurate. Please don't read into that slide anything that is not specifically on it straight from the order. That is an additional policy discussion on what the requirements specifically should be that we're hoping to have at a later date, but it doesn't actually say anything more than what you just articulated. Hope that helps.
All right, Christina, I think we can move on.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Wait, do we have more questions? Sorry, Christina.
No, that was just me. I just wanted to make sure I was on the right slide.
Oh, yeah, you are. Okay, I'm going to plow through 15 and 16. This is the kind of the remaining ATC. So if in a later policy discussion, we confirm that entities want to pursue forward reservations of non-firm uses, the CAISO could release this remaining available transfer capability not already sold to support intertie transactions to, out of, or through the CAISO, the AA, at a lower priority than the secondary native load priority. Further discussions required, as we've mentioned multiple times. We think it seems reasonable to consider whether to make this available for reservation requests that can be confirmed prior to day-ahead market. Scheduling required for non-firm hourly requests should be considered. We just would like to have that at a later date in more detail, so it gives folks time to think about if the non-firm uses is something that, as an external entity, whether a marketer or an LSC, they would be interested in or not. Next slide. That brings us to really the bulk of this is the kind of, not the bulk, but the punchline is that what are we left with? And kind of back to Anthony's, is it imposing? It's not imposing. We are left with transmission schedules without a forward reservation. So self-schedules referencing forward transmission reservations would receive its corresponding priority through market processes. The lowest priority for self-schedules would be afforded to all day-ahead and real-time self-schedules offered into the market. Self-schedules cleared in CAISO markets but not supported by a forward reservation will receive this lowest priority than those backed by forward reservations, but higher priority than self-schedules not previously cleared. All I mean by that is a day-ahead self-schedule not backed with a forward reservation clears the CAISO market. When it feeds into the real-time market, it will have a higher priority in real-time than a new real-time self-schedule without a forward reservation or day-ahead reservation. And again, open question, would other reservation types other than non-firm point-to-point be useful or necessary for entities wanting to seek those instead of opting in for the lowest level? With that said, can we move to the next slide? Given time, I'm going to suggest we start going through the next section rather than opening up for more questions. Jeff?
Sure. Thanks, Kathleen. I'll go through this quickly just in light of the time. So we've now moved through the discussion of the forward reservation process, and I do appreciate all the comments, and I respect that there's differing opinions, and some of them obviously strong in terms of what the right solution is. And I think to some of the Milos's recent comments, there are definitely details and variations in approaches, and so fundamentally, I think still, as I mentioned a couple times, what we really would like to see is the appropriate balance between native load priority and open access, and trying to find ways to achieve that. But as others have said, I think there's clearly more work to do to try to find a workable approach that meets those competing objectives. And the last couple of slides we had were really thinking a little bit more about the operating time frame. So day ahead real time, kind of what scheduling requirements would help support this. And so, as I mentioned, you have a forward process for reserving transmission, but how does that transmission get used? How does the customer gain the priority that they've purchased, and how do you achieve that? And so, first point is that the scheduling requirements are what would be needed to validate schedules and affirm that priority before you run the market, so that you know who's using what. And e-tags would play that role in terms of specifying the transmission reservation that would be submitted for a given market run to gain the priority. So that would be the tool to schedule on a forward transmission reservation. Because what that would do is it would give the visibility for the CAISO to assign the appropriate priorities and via penalty prices to valid schedules that are using those, essentially what are equivalent to network or point-to-point rights. And that would allow the transmission reservation information provided on the e-tag to it would support CAISO to identify what are the appropriate penalty prices, because ultimately those reservation priorities would need to get translated into penalty prices for purposes of dispatching the market. And maybe it's kind of obvious, but those penalty prices then would also have to be structured in such a way that they would respect the relevant curtailment priority of those different reservation service levels that are assigned. And we'll talk about it at the end. Next slide, please. So using this approach and submitting e-tags to provide this information would give the CAISO's approach more consistency with what other TSPs do, which is you submit an e-tag from the source to the sink, and then each of the TSPs evaluate that transmission, and to the extent that it's valid and it has the appropriate reservation IDs, then they consider that segment to be used. And so that would align the CAISO's e-tagging approach with what is standard practice across the West in terms of scheduling forward and day ahead transactions. And it also gives an improvement to the CAISO operators by providing them with the visibility of what transmission capability is being used, and provides them a means to measure whether or not those schedules are valid and actually going to be made available. A sort of related note is it also ensures that there's a consistent demonstration by someone that's seeking to schedule that they've got the resource and transmission arranged across the full path before they get the high priority schedule, but also before the CAISO displaces or curtails other schedules. And this was something we raised as a concern even in the context of the interim solution, where there is a risk of, without this, the CAISO displacing a legitimate transaction, whether it's an import or a wheel through that's been tagged and has supply, et cetera, arranged. There's a risk that that gets curtailed in favor of a transaction that may not have a physical resource behind it or a transmission, and that doesn't seem to be a good outcome to the extent that the CAISO is curtailing schedules to make room for others that may not ultimately show up. So this type of arrangement would be beneficial in terms of providing that consistency, and ultimately it would result in a comparable treatment both for wheel-through schedules and RA imports, which is obviously another area that was debated when the mechanics of the interim solution were being worked through. Last thing, just from an export perspective, it would allow some means for entities to successfully schedule export energy during key periods. Next slide, please. So now just quickly on the curtailments. I think we all know that the CAISO markets are striving to the extent possible to respect self-schedules through the optimization and avoid curtailing them. But of course, all of this really is focused on those instances when the CAISO has to make an adjustment or a curtailment to those self-schedules in order to resolve congestion across the system. And so I think the concept, hopefully, that is straightforward is that the priorities that are arranged through the forward transmission process would be respected through the curtailments and through the penalty prices that result in those curtailments. So that would be basically following the curtailment priorities set forward by NASB and NERC. And I think obviously these are details again that we need to work through, but basically the same concepts that we were showing before around firm translates into a 7F priority. The secondary native load priority would be the next level down at a 6NN, and then you would go down from there. So basically this would just be a detail, but an important one that would ensure that the curtailment priorities match the intended order of operations when you have to make curtailments in a particular period. Next slide, please. That might be the last one I forgot. Oh yeah, one more, sorry about that. I think this is the last slide. So, again, I already walked through most of this. We need penalty prices for valid schedules to match the appropriate priorities. That would start with firm. So you would have the primary network service that was arranged for through the native load priority, as well as any firm reservations that were made. Those would be curtailed pro rata as firm schedules. The second highest priority would be other imports arranged to the CAISO BA that would receive the equivalent of network economy, which is priority 6. And then, as Kathleen has pointed out several times, whether or not there are other lower priority forward transmission reservations or not on the interties is something that would be worth discussing, but ultimately the lowest priority would fall with respect to intertie transactions to day-ahead or real-time schedules that are bid into the market but not supported by any forward transmission service at all. Those would be deferential to the others that we listed above. So again, details that would need to get worked through. I believe that's the last slide we have, so I'll stop there and ask Kathleen if she has any further comments. Otherwise, we could probably take a couple more questions before we run out of time.
No, I think just one quick comment and then like to leave it for questions is that, I heard you say something which is worth reemphasizing, the scheduling requirement to add an ETAG scheduling requirement prior to day ahead still has value, even if a forward reservation process doesn't move forward. And, specifically for the CAISO needs to make judgments in an out of market adjustment process, which we introduced fairly recently, last couple of years. It could aid that process. So just wanted to emphasize that there's still value there regardless of that, and then turn it over to questions.
Kathleen, I'm sorry, just one other quick point was some of these discussions on scheduling and curtailment too have also been coming up in the EDAM discussions, because that's another area where there are rules necessary to work out how EDAM will function, and that touches on a number of areas, but one is resource efficiency requirements and how to validate schedules being used for resource efficiency between BAs, but also just transmission, the transmission between BAs being used to support potential EDAM transfers, and how do you put all of those pieces together in that context as well. So I think some of these concepts in these later slides would be applicable under EDAM and worth debating in those forums as well.
I don't see anybody with their hand raised. Well, just a reminder, you can either select the icon, the chat window, the hand icon, or if you just dialed in, you'll want to press #2 on your device. Right, I'm not seeing anybody in the queue. Did you have any final comments, Jeff or Kathleen, before I turn it back over to Milos?
I do, unless you want to go first, Jeff.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to thank the group for allowing Christina for helping us to set this up. Thank you so much. And for everyone to engage in this conversation. I've taken lots of notes, appreciate all of the feedback and suggestions. I wanted to reemphasize that we really see this as a starting place of putting forward principles, and that we hope that we have a chance to, and there's an interest on part of the CAISO and others to keep having this dialogue and delve into some of these details, because honestly, like the ATC thing itself is an entire 2-hour meeting. Look forward to having and kind of delve into more of those details. With that said, and some of the other comments about from Anthony on, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. The intent of what we're putting forward is a proposal that we believe integrates with the existing processes that the CAISO is performing in some way. Additional conversations on how those would be integrated, I think, is what I have thought through as the next tier level of conversations. But it is intended for it to leverage existing functionality, existing studies, existing calculations, and make enhancements to them. So when I thought about next steps, I think a really good next step is having a working group meeting that I would characterize as, okay, now what are the ATC calculation enhancements that we would need to explore to support this framework? Another meeting would be, or another conversation, because I really do think that would be a 2-hour meeting. Another meeting would be, let's have a policy discussion on what whether non-firm uses are needed in a longer, a forward reservation process or not, so that we can come with some clarity and feedback from the stakeholder community on that to help inform this durable framework proposal. Another issue raised here, well put, is how does this integrate with the CAISO's existing studies? That's a thing I think, Milos has done a great job of having folks come in and give background, which makes clear that that's a conversation we need to have. Just that it's one that would be another working group meeting on how do we do that in the CAISO. Looking forward to having those conversations. I hope you take this in the spirit it's meant to be furthering our market design to kind of protect that delicate balance we've been talking about in an open access and non-discriminatory way. And I look forward to having those deeper conversations, hopefully in a few more meetings that we could set up if this is something that we want to keep talking about. That's all.
Jeff,
Okay.
did you have any?
Oh, sorry.
I'll just add thank you to the CAISO and for everyone for participating, and I appreciate the feedback, appreciate the questions. There were some good ones, and thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
All right, Christina, this is Milos. Maybe I'll jump in and again express our gratitude to both PowerX, Jeff, and Vistra, Kathleen. Really appreciate you walking us through this, putting in the time and the effort. I think, as you both said, some good questions have been raised throughout this, but I think this gives us a good sense of, what's out there and what a framework could look like. We have to work through some issues as we've noted through, but I think it's a good starting point for discussion. And so what we're going to be looking to do next is similar along the lines of what you suggested, Kathleen. Now that we've kind of walked through what we've heard from others, how they do certain aspects of that process, both from the ATC reservation and the planning perspective, we're going to look now to facilitate upcoming working group discussions to talk about some of those discrete elements. I think we'll dedicate some time to talk about how we could calculate some of the native load needs and the inputs, and the different components of the methodology, then focusing on the reservation process and the types of products. I think you give us a good starting point of something to consider, and I think we can then build on that and work through some of the issues that we've heard and the interplay with other processes and other frameworks and other, the resource adequacy program. And then the third, I think, component is looking at the planning interactions and the expansion element of it. But that's what we'll look to do next, is facilitate some of these discussions now. How could what we've learned apply to the ISO, and having heard also some of the perspectives from yourself and the California LSEs, have a robust discussion on that. So really appreciate you both taking the time, really appreciate the good discussion and the good questions. It's a tough issue, but I think we'll have some more discussions on it here in the coming weeks in the working group. So with that, Christina, I'll turn it over to you to close this down.
Great. Yeah, and when we do schedule those meetings, we will issue a notice with the details. So once we, confirm some dates, we can send those out. And then again, the presentation, PowerX and Vistra's presentation is out on the initiative webpage. It's linked here on the slide. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to just email me at the either of the email addresses listed on this slide as well. So thank you very much. Appreciate your participation in these working group meetings, and have a great rest of your day.